Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Idea Roastery. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
So, Herman, you've been a busy boy recently. You've been taking on a few courses. You've started doing a few crafts and hobbies. Do you want to tell us what you've been up to and maybe a little bit about why you've decided to do those things?
Yeah, sure. Well, over the past, let's call it the last month or two, I have done a leatherworking course in Brockenfell in the northern suburbs, given by just like a lovely old Afrikaans couple who travel around South Africa and Namibia teaching people how to do leatherworking good, and made some really cool bags and receptacles and everything. And now everyone is getting like a cool bag for Christmas. And then I did a introduction to woodworking class in Pardon Island, and that's given by a like the oldest man who's just got like 60, 70 years of grizzled knowledge on, how to keep your fingers in the wood shop. And I also have a workshop, which I know I've mentioned on a couple of other episodes, but it's just a place that Emma, myself, and whoever is free that evening just get together and jam. Like I'll make something out of leather. Emma will be sewing, Rico will be sewing, Simon will be sketching in the corner. My sister came and like made some leather stuff with me, but she also likes to knit. And so it's just like a nice little shared space for us to go and do crafty things. And the reason behind this is fairly straightforward. Knowledge workers, we spend so much time behind a computer just playing around with bits on a screen. And in this, for fear of sounding a bit too Marxist, is that we're a couple steps away from the fruit of our labor, right? It's not as inherently satisfying as going from raw material to a completed product that you can hold in your hands and feel and be like, look at this thing that I made. And what I've also come to realize is that this doesn't really have a lot of economic value. And that's kind of the point, is that if I want a leather briefcase, say, it is significantly cheaper for me to go and buy one if I factor in the amount of time it takes for me to do it at a reasonable rate that I would be happy being paid, because of this arbitrage of labor, right? Like having something manufactured in China or Vietnam, you cannot compete with it. You also arguably can't really compete with the high skilled labor in those places that are churning out, bags for Hermes and
Mm,
stuff like that.
mm.
But it is inherently satisfying to do in and of itself.
I think what you're touching on there is the idea of specialism. And I know it because I recently tried to make bread, and
Yeah.
and it was like I was like had this idea of a nice sourdough loaf. So I started about 5 days before I even needed to get the bread started and making a starter and doing all that process of like letting it sort of bubble and like putting it in the fridge. It just takes so damn long, right? And I think this is why specialism is a big factor in, I guess, the development of the general, like just people in general, like having specialists who could like become really like well crafted in that area allowed you to not have to do it for yourself, which would have taken lots of time. And I think maybe because people have less time now, it's almost like a self-fulfilling kind of wheel where like you have less time, so you rely on specialists. And because you rely on specialists, you don't know how to do those crafts. And so I think it's also like there's parts of it where you're trying to, where, like, as you said, like people are like really locked into their computers all day. And I also think it's like there's a bit of an outlet, a requirement for the brain where you need to have a way to have calmness and just disconnection. And I think for a lot of people, they've lost that ability to disconnect in a way. And that's, I guess, also why things like meditation are also becoming more prevalent, is that people are so connected into like social media and the internet and doing things online and working, and maybe also a Marxist thing. Maybe they're working too hard on these things that they don't have a way to outlet into crafts and all of those other things. And I
Mm.
think, as you mentioned, art is it has a similar effect.
I completely agree with you over there, is that in our hyper-connected world, you can never, unless you choose to be, you can never be disconnected, right? Is if you're sitting on the couch and you're like, I don't really know what to do right now. You can always
Mm,
fill that gap with checking Hacker News, checking the various social media platforms, scrolling on Reddit,
mm,
TikTok, if that's your cup of tea. Um, and I think what hobbies and crafts do is they kind of like bring you back to yourself where you find yourself in a state of flow in something that is, I don't want to say technically challenging because like let's say for instance knitting isn't necessarily technically challenging, but it's just something that you can gently engage with. And I think it's that
Mm,
like gentle engagement that is what we're looking for, right?
mm,
Especially with knowledge workers where we don't, you know, fiddle around with stuff in our hands.
yeah.
It's a very um, intangible tangibility
Mm,
that comes with that is I feel that I certainly am missing it, and many other, especially programmers who I speak to,
mm,
are, you know, they're saying like I want to become a farmer or I want
mm,
to you know, go and take a blacksmithing class so that I can
yeah.
blacksmith things. And I think
Yeah.
that that's actually quite a beautiful thing. And then there's also ones where it's like also very practical. So you're familiar with Rico.
Mm,
So he's a large man, like
mhm,
size 17 shoe large.
mm,
And he kind of has always had to wear clothes that he could just find in his size,
mm,
right? Which means he'd be regularly wearing just like uh outdoorsy Jeep shirts because they make those in his size.
yeah.
Um, but now he's started sewing and he can make himself like flamboyantly colorful t-shirts and he's made
Mm,
himself like a floral pair of jeans and
mm,
he's just like so well decked out all the time because he's now got this hobby that he gets to spend time thinking
mm,
about and researching and executing. And at the end, there's this tangible product that changes his entire appearance. It changes the way that other people perceive him. And I think that's such a cool
mm,
thing, right? In the same
yeah.
way that like my brother is currently restoring a 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle,
Mm,
and you know, it's there's a whole bunch of the like learning about the mechanics of it, realizing that you have to buy a whole bunch of like imperially sized tools, and
mm,
then cleaning things, respraying things, doing all this learning and crafting, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, you've got like this really cool car that you can drive around in.
yeah. I like the fact that it's like I think people become dependent on these things. And so I think it's kind of I guess it's freeing in a way because you like I think most people have like an inside of them they don't want to be beholden to anybody. And I think it's kind of the same when you look at things like the off-grid movement where people just want to
Mm.
like they want to know that if there was like an apocalypse or something that they'd be able to survive and that they don't need to have all of this stuff that like is constantly like shoved in our faces every day. But it's also nice that like through that outlet, there's it's almost like you can express yourself better because you know how to create clothes, and so you can make whatever clothes you kind of like want, and so you're not really stuck by the styles that other people show you. Um,
Yeah.
uh, but the other thing that you touched on was I think the problem with programmers, right? And I see this with myself, is that I find that because I enjoy programming and it is just so accessible, um, a lot of my hobbies would be actually doing code, right? Or in the domain of coding. So, like for instance, when someone who's not a programmer goes home from work, they're kind of there's nothing to do, right? I mean, there's nothing in terms of like they do hobbies, right? Normal, traditional hobbies. Whereas when you're a programmer, you can go home and you can fire up your laptop and you can do more programming, right? And
Yeah, you can make a game, you
you
can
can make
work
a
on your
game,
side business or
and
make
I
a
think
silly tool on the internet.
yeah, and I think maybe also if you're good at programming and you know what you're doing there, and you get some sort of boost from it, because I think no one like people who enjoy programming like they do it because they enjoy it.
Mm,
Then why wouldn't you do it after work as well? And I think maybe that there's a bit of a problem there where uh like you're both working as a software developer and you're also doing side projects in software, or you're like sort of fleshing it out, and so you're constantly in this like digital world making code, like, and you're also doing stupid stuff like debugging like JavaScript libraries and dependencies. And I've like learned like six or seven like esoteric like programming languages. I really enjoy it, but it's not like what traditionally people think about with hobbies. And it's
yeah.
almost like there's a bit of a I feel like a stigma almost when people are like, hey, what do you do after work? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I just like, code and hack around on my computer and stuff. Um, and so I think it's like maybe a lot more people, like they do have more time, I guess. And I think there's also time is a big factor of it because I think back in the day when people were on farms, you had like a lot of time. And so when you were bored, you were just like, oh, well, maybe I could, rustle up like a loaf of bread, or maybe I can, fix up that car over there and get it running. And it was kind of just more of a way to pass the time, really, that you had to do these crafts. And then also, obviously, it had a utility in the fact that you could like sit on a chair or you could mend something. And I think that is uh, maybe a factor of moving to cities and like urbanization is that there's a lot less time and a lot less space also in which to do these things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you over there. I mean, but a bunch of my hobbies are also um, in on my computer.
Yeah.
But I think that that whole tangibility factor still applies over there. Is that you're
Mm,
taking like what is generally like a smallish idea and you're nurturing it and you're playing around with it and
mm,
creating something that you're sort of emotionally attached to, um,
mm,
as opposed to, just being part of the company that you're working for, right?
mm,
Um, I think that what these hobbies kind of serve is this inherent need for humans to be in a state of flow
mm,
or to be in the creative process. And you'll see artists talk about this the entire time. Like they'll be like, no, humans are made to create. And then you have people who don't necessarily do any creative work, and after work they like go home and they watch Netflix and they are inherently consumptive. And they'll say like, no, this isn't true for everyone. But I'll go out on a limb and say it is actually true for everyone. And that when people find something that they enjoy creating, that they enjoy working on, it is
mm.
significantly more meaningful and more fulfilling to them than watching the latest episode of whatever Netflix series they
Yeah.
are they are currently on.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
I think
I don't mean to like yuck anyone's yum over there, but like I do believe this to be the case.
yeah, I think it's there seems to be I guess yeah, I feel like people also impose a level of busyness on themselves, right? And I think this is uh I think I don't know if it's a trend, but there's like a thread online where I've seen people saying that are people becoming more boring because if you like a majority of your day is probably spent sleeping and then work, and now people are doing gym for an hour, maybe every day or at
I mean,
least
gym's
two or
also
three.
a hobby, let's be entirely
It,
honest.
it, it is a
Like
hobby.
a certain baseline is for health, but then like anything above, like 2 to 3 times a week to maintain health, everything above that is kind of like you're a hobbyist fitness enthusiast.
But then I think people. I mean, if you look at the other factors like social life and those kind of things, I mean they all are types of hobbies, but I think people put like an over emphasis almost on it, and so going from your work to your social occasion to like going to sleep, like and only having really the weekends, I feel like people are manufacturing their own busyness, and so
Mm.
when they think about it and say, oh, I don't really have time for hobbies, it's kind of like it's just a factor of how they live that they don't have this time. Whereas, as you say, like people watching Netflix in the evening or
Mhm.
you know maybe going for too many drinks in the week are probably like foregoing that time that they could be spent doing those hobbies.
Dude, 100% is that like our grandparents' generation, they all had hobbies, right?
Mm,
Whether it was working on, lawnmower, this lawnmower go-kart that they were making,
mm,
or knitting doilies, or making birdhouses, or fly fishing, etc., etc. They all had hobbies. And I think the biggest killer of hobbies is passive consumption that we've created, right? It's television, and now super accessible things like YouTube and Netflix and TikTok
mm,
and all of that is that it is so easy currently to be passive. Whereas with our grandparents' generation, they arguably didn't have like even a TV. And
mm,
so they would finish up work and they worked longer hours than us, right? Like this entire thing where it's like people don't have enough time in the day to do things. we have more time in the day than arguably any other time in post-industrial history, right? It's nice that we've got like 40-hour work weeks kind of mandated by
Yeah.
governments across the world. And so what happens is we get home, and now if you didn't have a television or any other way to entertain yourself, you're not going to just sit at home and like stare out the window. You're going to
Mm,
find something to engage yourself with, right?
mm,
Like, yes, there are other consumptive hobbies like reading, but that also takes a bit more of an active effort than television. And I'd say that it's also not as addictive, right? And now you've got all this
mm.
time, you're like, shit, I need to do something with my evening. And so you start knitting a doily, or you start carving a wooden cat, or you start painting, or you start collecting stamps, collecting spoons, working on this old car, all of
Yeah.
these things. And so, yeah, it's just these ultra consumptive hobbies are really what's fucked us, huh?
Yeah, yeah. But I think I do recognize, I guess there is like a bit of like a privilege aspect to it because I think if you think of people who are less fortunate than us, they do have harder lives by based on the fact that they don't necessarily have things like washing machines. Like if you look at like the I guess the invention of the washing machine, like it was like before that women would spend a large portion of their day like washing clothes. And then the invention of the washing machine came that was like allowed people to like use the washing machine. But uh instead of like reducing the workload for people, it just became accustomed to have washed your clothes more frequently. So you had to
Mm.
like you could only wear one shirt a day rather than one shirt during the week. And so it kind of like even though the washing machine was invented, there was still like less time because people were like using that. But I guess also, people who are working like blue collar jobs, they also have like commuting and all of that kind of stuff. Commuting is actually a big factor. And especially in London, I've noticed that people are pretty okay for what a 30-minute commute on the train, and sometimes even longer. But like 30 minutes, 1 hour each, like just to get to and fro from work is also like taking up a lot of time. And I guess some people make use of it to read and um, sort of make it useful at least. But it's not
Mm.
really like something that's someone would overly say that's like a hobby, right? Or like time for a hobby.
I agree with you over there. So my mom's hobby is she takes really long walks, right? It is
Mm,
both a health thing and also a hobby thing. So she'll wake up at like 4. I mean, she's turning 70
mm,
next year. And so she wakes up early anyway.
mm,
And she puts on an audiobook and she walks for an hour and a half around this estate that she's in on the Hobbies Dam. And
mm,
then that halfway, so hour and a half into her walk, she meets up with some other friends who are in their state who are walking their dogs and stuff, and they'll have a coffee together and take a walk together. And then by the time she gets home, she's had like a 2.5 to 3 hour walk, right? And it's
mm,
she gets to listen to her audiobook, she gets to hang out with her friends and have coffee, and
mm,
she gets to do that every single day. She's done like something silly like 3,000 kilometers this year so far.
mm,
Um, and I think that that's really neat. And I do know some people who do enjoy their commute in that it's their time to like catch up with their podcasts and stuff,
mm,
especially people who have like a busy work life and a busy home like life. Like if they,
mm,
work a job, a 9 to 5 in an office, and then at home they've got like kids and domestic
mm,
responsibilities
mm,
and everything, is you can easily have, half an hour, 45 minutes of podcasts
mm,
to get through every day, that you do, or like an audiobook that you do really want to read
mm.
slash listen to. And in some cases, like a commute is the only time that you get to enjoy that content.
I think the point on kids, I think, is also an interesting one because I like as I've started to get older, I'm interacting more with sort of early parents, and I think the fulfilling people's time aspect comes in there as well, where you talk to like sort of a new dad or something like that, and you like,
They don't
hey,
have time for anything.
they don't have time for anything, and I understand it, like you're looking after your kid, but it's almost that at some point it feels like it's almost like a crutch where they're like
Mm.
they use their kids as an excuse not to have like their own hobbies. And I think it's very important, especially for like guys, to have like time to do like cool stuff and like go out with your buddies and like go like doing stupid stuff. Like I think there is like a definite need to have that outlet. And I think it's more also along this line of like, are people becoming a little bit more boring because they're like using these other excuses to not have like hobbies. But I also
Mm,
think it seems like there's also, as you get older, there's more of a stigma to doing something that's crazy. Like, if someone buys a Harley Davidson and starts to ride around, people say, oh, he's having a midlife crisis. But it's like,
yeah.
like, why can't you like skydiving when you're like in your 30s? Like, I mean, it's like a hobby just like anything else.
I think that comes from no, that comes from a very human place where people want to like bring down other people because not because they actually have any criticisms for that person, but because it's a reflection on the fact that they're not doing
Mm,
something like that, right? Like the reason why people make fun of people in sports
mm.
cars, is because secretly
Yeah,
like everyone wants to
yeah,
have a nice car, right? It
mm,
goes brum brum and
yeah,
it goes fast and that's cool, right? And so I think that like nowadays when I see like a middle-aged dude on,
mm,
a new Harley Davidson, I'm like,
yeah,
nice son,
yeah,
you went and you did the thing. And
yeah,
he's like, pop, 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 pop,
yeah.
pop.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like, I'm hoping that this like newer generation will continue to be doing some interesting things, because I know for myself, I don't want to like get to a point where I'm just like living day by day, like, in this like sort of monotonous rut. I do realize that things are getting a little bit more expensive, and so finding hobbies that are more accessible is also important.
I think that is actually a very good point you bring up, is that hobbies, as you said, tend to tend to be a
Mm,
luxury thing in many cases. They shouldn't be. Like going and playing five-a-side football with your friends should be available
yeah.
to pretty much everyone from every bracket, but it's also not really because, you have
Mm,
to rent the court and
pitch.
uh, stuff like that. But like yeah, pitch. But the you're
Yes,
familiar with
yes,
paddle, the tennis-like thing that swept
yeah,
swept through the world. Is a paddle court in every corner of
yeah.
every major city on the globe right now. Um, a paddle racket is
Mm,
so expensive. It's like it even makes me
mm,
sweat a little bit, and I'm you know
yeah.
I'm paid all right. Um, and so I think that that's definitely also a barrier to
Mm,
entry for getting into paddle because you're like, should I have to get the gear before I really get in, like, know how much I'm going to enjoy it? I guess you
mm,
can rent rackets and stuff
yeah,
at the thing, but I was quite shocked with the price of a paddle racket. And this applies to many other arts and crafts and everything, where you go into Deckle Edge, which is the big art store here in Cape Town, and like you can easily spend 1,000
yeah,
rand on just some
yeah.
watercolors and some paintbrushes. You can then go and buy that same
Mm,
stuff on Temu for,
yeah, yeah.
a tenth of the price, but like they know who they're serving here.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I agree. I think there is like there's like a certain threshold. And another interesting thing, which is also, I was listening to an audiobook about it, is when it comes to like invention, it seems to be that when people invent new things, tends to happen in places where there's abundance,
Mm.
right? So Silicon Valley has an abundance of money, and this seems to proliferate this innovation cycle even in society. And maybe it's a factor of innovation that, being able to tinker and have time is something that you tend to do if you're not like trying to sustain yourself like sort of on a human level. So I think it is like an interesting factor that, like,
Yeah, I mean, like the development of the motor vehicle literally came from like companies making racing cars for aristocrats.
yeah,
Right. Like
yeah,
like the advancement of the internal combustion engine wasn't through practicality. It was
mm,
like we want to make this go faster so I can
yeah.
beat Jeffrey down the way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like Orville and Wilbur Wright, like they were making money from their bicycle shop that they had a time on the weekend to like fiddle around and
Make
make
an
this like
airplane,
like
right?
airplanes, right? So
Yeah.
I guess but I guess maybe to sort of head towards the end, I think one question we could go talk about is, how do we enable more hobbies in specifically cities? because we mentioned that
Yeah.
there's like an idea of space and there's an idea of money. Like, what are like some ways that we can enable people to have hobbies?
So I've been thinking about this quite a bit over the past couple of months. I think that there are a couple of things. The first one is that there needs to be classes, right? And they need to be fairly
Mm,
affordable. So right now, Emma and my sister and a couple of their friends are doing a sewing class every Monday evening, and it's actually fairly affordable. Um,
mm,
you know, a couple $100 per lesson, which is affordable for lower middle class, but it's certainly not affordable to people who are, poverty stricken. Um, and that's pretty neat. The leatherworking course that I did, they have single day courses if you want. So I think it's just like a proliferation of classes, salsa classes. So, you want to get into salsa dancing, you can go and you can do salsa classes in pretty much every major city in the
mm.
world. But then I think a secondary part is a space for people to do that in. So in some parts of the world, there are like maker spaces, these shared workshops where you can
Yeah,
pay a monthly subscription and you have access to a workshop. Not everyone is as privileged as Emma and I to actually like go and get an entire workshop space to ourselves. Just having like a hot desk in a workshop is such a cool thing that allows you to go
mm,
and do these things, especially if it's like based by, hour or like you can come in 2 evenings a week because most people
yeah,
aren't going to go and use their workshop every day. I know I don't.
yeah,
And so I
exactly.
have a like heavily underutilized resource over there, which does
Mm,
kind of suck. Um,
yeah.
and I'd say that those are the two things, the place where you can get the
Mm.
knowledge of it, and then the place where you can go and you can do the hobby are the big ones.
Yeah, no, I think I agree, and it's kind of highlighted in what you were talking about in the story, where you and your friends all go to the same space and like you're all making alongside each other. Is that there is actually like a community aspect to this, and I guess this is where things like community farming come in, and having like communal spaces, and like here in the UK, they're quite, I guess, good at that. They have like community centers and stuff where people can go and do stuff, but I think also like the like co-working spaces, co-making spaces are also something that I think should become a little bit more accessible, because I mean, even like I think here in the UK, like just to get a co-working space is quite prohibitively expensive if you don't have some form of income. And so like yeah, having, I guess here you could use libraries and stuff like that. So there is always somewhere you could go. But yeah, like specifically like having ways to access like tools and equipment and stuff like that. And I think especially with this like sort of mini trend of people wanting to build more things and like engineer stuff, I think it's good to have at least a space where you can go and access that. Like for me, if I wanted to 3D print something, for instance, I wouldn't really know where to go to do that. And so maybe there's also an aspect of innovation that needs to happen around like how people can rent spaces for like an hour, or is there a way that they can, you know, borrow or timeshare certain equipment so that they can do these kind of things. And I think that will lower the price, that you don't have to go and buy like a whole easel and buy your paints and buy all of these things. You could kind of just use it. And I guess also it just means that you need cheap sort of rentable space, even for the classes, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if you wanted to do like a yoga studio, you'd have to like book for like a month or two or even like longer.
Mm.
And so,
It
yeah,
is it, it is a pity that we've gotten to the end of this episode and we haven't really touched on the whole community
yeah,
aspect, but just in a nutshell, it's like hobbies are access to a community,
yeah, yeah,
right? Like, do you like motorcycles? There's a motorcycle
yeah,
community. Do you like dancing salsa? There's a salsa community. Do you like, you know, uh, all these things
yeah.
are like really good gateways to meeting other people who you'll probably get along
Yeah,
with.
and I think it's also um it's also something that I've learned recently, is that trying to combine it's like social with hobby is a good way to kind of hack your way to doing more hobbies, right? There's a bit of a challenge there too, is that sometimes your friends aren't always up for the same hobbies you are, but someone said that a good piece of advice is just go do the thing and meet people who are doing the thing and ask them if they want to do more of that thing with you, and that's how you like sort of start to build a
I like
community.
that.